So it's very good to be here speaking to you again. It's a great opportunity, and we really appreciate that. Just very quickly, I think it was already mentioned, IHS as being one of the premier providers of automotive data and forecast information around the world. Just a very quick side note, I have to say this is very, very fresh. It's actually less than a week old. IHS is now part of Standard & Poor's Global. Perhaps you're already familiar with Standard & Poor's from their rating services and stock indices. The two companies are now one, and we're obviously very excited about everything that we're going to be able to offer our customers and our contacts together, including, of course, the audience that we're speaking with today. As was already mentioned, I lead the commercial vehicle forecast team in the company. We are, as was already mentioned, based around the world. We focus exclusively on commercial vehicles, so this is not a side project. This is all we do. In addition to that, we're very, very fortunate to be able to lean on similar teams in many, many other areas, including agribusiness, economics, energy, just to name a few. So we're very fortunate to be able to build up our truck market outlooks and forecasts for Mexico as well as North America with all of this additional information. I think that's enough about the company. Let's turn very quickly to just a very quick item of housekeeping. We've got 3 sections to share with you today. Actually, I should sort of start here. I'm going to talk a little bit about the economic context around the world and also in Mexico and how the two are interlinked. Then I'm going to discuss some short-term truck market issues in Mexico, especially how we see prospects for 2022, 2023, and 2024. And then finally, I'll conclude with a couple comments on some structural issues similar to what we did a year ago, but I'll be able to talk a little bit about some things that are changed or some things that developed as expected, and hopefully leaving some time at the end for questions and answers. An important piece of housekeeping when it comes to speaking about any market, including Mexico, it's always important to be clear about what one is talking about. For those of you who are familiar, when IHS, now S&P, speaks about medium and heavy commercial vehicles, around the world, we're talking about vehicles that are over 6 tons metric gross vehicle weight. In the North American context, we're talking about class 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 trucks and buses. Most of what I'm going to show you here today is related to trucks. Coming specifically also to Mexico, a note on our data sources. We use and rely on many of the same sources that all of you do who are in the audience today, but we make some adjustments, and a very specific adjustment that we're making is shown on the slide in front of you here. Whenever we talk about the total truck market in class 4 to 8, one of the things that we do is we combine the existing sources on the medium heavy market with some information from our side, actually from other official sources, about the activities of Ford, Ram, formerly now Stellantis, obviously, as well as imports from China who don't participate in some of the official data exchanges. So the market totals that you may see here today for class 4 to 8 combined, they may appear a little bit higher than what you expect to see. It's not because we're counting buses in with the trucks. It's because of the way that we're handling some of these other brands, including Ford and Ram, and as I mentioned, several of the Chinese imports that are not included in the official data exchanges. So just keep that in the back of your mind. Other than that, our data are more or less fully reconciled with official sources, and we can always sort of get back to that official data if needed to answer a question, perhaps. Okay, so this is the first section or module, if you will, that we'd like to share with you, that I'd like to share with you today. It's really looking at the economics. And I think by and large, if anything, compared to a year ago, both in the context of Mexico, but also in the context of North America, things have developed more or less in line with expectations, but I think it's fair to say probably a little bit better. So all else equal, our economic expectations for this year are a little bit stronger than we thought they were going to be a year ago. Still, we don't expect Mexico's economic output to return to pre-pandemic levels until the very end of this year, calendar year 2022. So we continue to believe it's going to take just about 2 years to fully recover from the contraction that took place at the very start of 2020, as you can see here. Thereafter, we expect the pace of recovery obviously to slow, but growth will remain. I think the last time I presented to you, we talked about some of the issues kind of holding back the recovery in Mexico compared to maybe some other countries and regions around the world. Just to kind of recall or emphasize some of those points. A big one remains the dynamic around capital investment in Mexico. This chart here tells the story of investment up until the pre-pandemic period, showing about a decade's worth of data. The overall story is in the green bars, and what the green bars represent in any given quarter is the year-over-year percentage change in real investment spending. That's plant, equipment, etc. The green bars represent spending by private entities, corporations, such as many in our industry. The blue bars represent spending by public entities, perhaps in things like roads and bridges and railroads and so on. Obviously, that important element is the net part, how the two are combined. That's that green that I mentioned. And I think quickly, if you scan this chart with your eye, you can see the green isn't very strong. It's not very positive in very many quarters. In fact, especially in the last several years, it's been very, very weak. And the reason for that is, although, of course, private investment spending is taking place and you see positive quarters in every year, it's that drag from weak or declining, I should say, public investment spending that has really been bringing the total down. And this is one of the reasons why we've been cautious talking about prospects for an acceleration in Mexico's economic growth. I should say sharp acceleration. Having said that, the pandemic has changed things a little bit. This slide is the same slide, but with 2021 added. And you see that in 2021, you had not only a sharp rebound in private investment spending, that's that huge gray bar showing a growth rate of almost 40%, following, of course, several quarters of contraction in 2020. But you also see fairly strong numbers from public investment spending for the first time in many years. So there's a bit of a positive story there last year. Again, another element of that slightly more positive outlook, although this doesn't change the fundamental dynamic, but creates some perhaps better conditions for 2022. Just to put that in context, that COVID response, that slide showed public investment spending. Obviously, there are many other kinds of public support that might be provided. This slide here just puts in context government spending compared to some other economies in South America, in Latin America. Mexico is obviously on the right. 2021 is the orange bar, and clearly you see the fiscal deficit, which is the difference between spending and income by the government. It increased, so that shows clearly same thing that was shown here. The government increased spending. However, that increase in the spending, even though it looks very big here, was actually still relatively conservative and relatively modest compared to some other countries in the region. So just to kind of put that in context. Okay. So in summary, this is from our economics team, this headline, Mexico's economic recovery is on the slow track. It's there, but it's not sort of surging, sort of steaming forward very rapidly. Again, we think it's going to take about 2 years to offset that economic decline of 8.4% that took place in 2020. Last year's growth was about 5%, which is a great number, but it wasn't enough to close the gap. This year, we expect growth to be about 2.2%, which is actually a little bit below trend. And in 2023, we think we'll hit 2.3%, which is starting to approach that long-term trend. So solid, but modest. And there's positives and negatives. There's various reasons why we see things this way. I think on the positive side, obviously, the economy in North America as a whole, if we look across Mexico, United States, and Canada, is quite strong. Things are going pretty well. There's a good foundation. Coming on top of that, we seem to be on the good side, if you can say that, of the COVID trend. It seems to be more and more behind us. We seem to be able to look forward to a future with fewer challenges, I should say, related to COVID than we've experienced in the past 24 months. Those are some of the positives. On the negative side, there are several as well. In addition to some of the structural issues related to investment, we've got very high inflation, not just in Mexico, but across North America. We've got central banks that need to respond to that, to try to stabilize price expectations. And Mexico's central bank has begun to do that. Our forecast is that not only have we just seen some interest rate increases, we will continue to see interest rate increases as we go through 2022. Eventually, that will become a headwind, we believe, the economic activity. And then finally, we've got a couple other things. Obviously, supply chain issues, in particular the semiconductor shortage affecting our industry, we believe will remain with us in 2022. We do see that getting better slowly, but not dramatically and not quickly. And then also, as a side note here, our economics team, our country team, notes ongoing, operational and security risks. But really, I'd like to add to that too, and I'll say a little bit more about this in a second, is really all the questions around the Russia-Ukraine situation, the rising oil prices and other associated effects, and what that might mean for North America and for Mexico. Most of the forecasts I'm showing you here were completed prior to the escalation of hostilities between Russia and Ukraine. So I think throughout, as we go with the remaining slides, I'll try to comment verbally on what some of those effects might be. But just very quickly, from an economic perspective, one effect we certainly see is potentially even more inflationary pressure, which again may force tougher decisions by the central bank. That's the context. Just kind of going very quickly through a couple things. This is a purchasing manager index for the world, and then also for some of the major regions. You can think about it a little bit as business confidence. There's really two takeaways here, just very quickly. Any value over 50 is good and signals an economic expansion. When we look both globally at manufacturing and services, and we look at the individual major regions, US, Eurozone, mainland China, and Japan, all of them are at or above 50. This is what was mentioned earlier. The background, or the foundation rather, for this year is strong. Having said that, though, you do note the trend in sort of the December-January period has been down, reflecting a number of challenges, but including signals coming through the Omicron COVID wave, which was passing through many of our countries in the winter. Okay, the next two slides just really come back to the interest rate picture for Mexico and how we see things. This slide shows inflation against policy interest rates in Mexico. The space between the red lines shows kind of a target inflation rate. The takeaway is easy. When inflation is above the target rate, interest rates tend to rise. You see that in 2017, 2018, and you're seeing that again now in 2021. when prices are rising in line with the target bandwidth, interest rates come down. Right now, we're in a period, obviously, where we expect ongoing interest rate increases. And as I mentioned, our economics team expects another several more rounds of tightening in calendar year 2022. This slide here basically makes that point. Again, you can see the interest rates for Mexico in gray, and then some of the other regional economies in some of the other colors there. A couple other aspects to the outlook here. I've already mentioned the GDP outlook on the left, upper left, I should say. How do we see a few other things? So we do think that eventually interest rate increases are going to get inflation under control. You can see that in the upper right. We see inflation dropping below 4% as of 2023, and then remaining there in 2024. Also, alongside that, we do think that with the moves by the central bank to raise interest rates and some other factors, we actually see the exchange rate of the Mexican peso in the bottom left holding somewhat steady over the next couple of years. We don't expect a dramatic shift there. Okay, and as I already mentioned, all of this leads Mexico to its pre-pandemic level of economic output by the end of 2022, we think. And you can see some of the international context here for when other regions reach that level. So let's take a look now at what might be happening in 2022 beyond some interest rate increases to combat inflation. What's also important when looking at Mexico, obviously, is what's going on in the rest of the world and the United States in particular. We all know that our truck markets, transporting goods and everything around that is very closely related throughout North America. The chart on the left shows the relationship between the Mexican and the US truck markets. And I think the obvious takeaway is all of the big moves up or down, they tend to be very, very close. So it makes sense to pause for a second and talk a little bit about what we expect the United States to do or experience this year. We can start with economic growth. The US was one of two major economies in 2021 that more than offset the entire pandemic decline. The other one was mainland China. And in both cases, that result was due to massive government stimulus. In 2022, we're still seeing the effects of that stimulus in the United States. We're going to have another above trend year of economic growth, we think. And then as we head into 2023, we do think that some of that momentum is going to begin to fade. Here too, we're seeing interest rates rise, particularly long-term rates at this point, and we expect to start seeing things like construction, home construction in particular, to start slowing down. But we're also starting to see signs that consumer spending, which was basically roaring for a year and a half, will begin to moderate its pace of growth, shall we say, sort of bringing the economy back to a normal growth level by the time we get into 23. This is a very important background factor looking at the truck market. When we look at the US truck market, this is what we expect to see. You've got heavy trucks on the left, you've got mediums on the right. In both cases, we expect to see some growth in 2022. We believe, both because of economic factors, but also replacement cycle dynamics, that the market will head into a down cycle starting in 2023. You can see that on both halves of the chart. But this year, all else equal, we expect to be fairly strong, owing to ongoing above trend economic growth, strong pent-up demand, and we hope slightly improved conditions for vehicle production, owing to modest improvements, perhaps in parts availability, chips availability, and other things like that, kind of helping to deliver that last bit of growth. Okay, let's turn now to Mexico. So in 2021, Mexico in the truck market experienced a solid recovery. On the left, you can see the growth rates in the full year 2021 against the full year 2020. Again, the market is measured as I described it, so there's some slight modifications, particularly to that straight truck side, where you've got also Ford and Ram included. But we've got almost 10% increase in tractor trucks. Most of those are Class 8. And we've got over 30% growth seen in straight trucks, including medium and heavy. So very, very solid increases there. That tractor truck increase was a little bit less than what we saw in the United States, but it was very much in line with the type of growth rate that we observed in Canada for last year. In the case of Mexico, we think the sort of modest pace of recovery in tractor trucks, again, compared to the US, may be still due to some of the lingering effects of the last emission change and the surge in the pre-buy activity that took place then. So that may still be casting a little bit of a shadow. Other factors may also be at work, though, including product availability, for example. When we look by brand at 2021, I think that what we see is that the top 5 brands, among them, the big distinction we really see is between Freightliner and Kenworth on the one hand and the rest. To some extent, Freightliner and Kenworth are obviously the largest brands, as you can see, based on how much larger their bars are compared to the other brands. And they're also very heavily exposed to this tractor truck market, where they're very successful. But perhaps because of that, this level of growth seen in 2021 compared to 2020 was maybe a little more modest than what we show here for some of the other brands, particularly Ram and Isuzu, which are much more present in the straight truck and chassis side of the market. So as we went through the year, this slide here shows annualized truck selling rates. This is based on a seasonal adjustment in the monthly sales data that are reported, which again, we're all getting. And then we've gone ahead and annualized that statistically so that you can look at every month and basically answer the question, if the market continued to perform that way for 12 months, what would the full year be? That's essentially what this tells us. And the nice thing about looking at the market this way is you can compare not just to the same month prior year, but you can compare back and forth to last month and next month. So it also allows sequential comparisons. Basically, if the line is going up, momentum is increasing, and if the line is going down, the market is weakening. It's very easy to read. And when we look at 2021, what we see is we had a very strong start to the year, where if you can see my mouse there, and then things kind of deflated in the middle of 2021. And that was the same pattern, by the way, that we observed in the United States also. A lot of that had to do with simply poor vehicle availability. Summer 2021, especially late summer, was a period when COVID created some unique challenges in the supply chain, kind of some echo effects that were not foreseen, particularly in Southeast Asia, in countries like Malaysia and Vietnam, just to name it 2. Those effects magnified all of the supply chain and parts availability problems that we had, which the industry was managing pretty well up until then, and basically made those problems less manageable. The consequence was a decrease in production all across North America and decreased product availability. And that's part of what's visible here in the Mexican data. As we ended 2021, though, things were getting better. We did see increases across North America, both in medium duty and heavy duty truck production. We also even saw some stabilization or slight increases in inventories at the end of the year. Together, those things meant that selling rates could increase, and that's what we're seeing here in the Mexican data. Question is, what does it mean for 2022? That annualized rate in January is 36,000 units annualized. I'll tell you right now, that's above our forecast. We think there's some problems assuming that selling rate will continue like that for the whole year. One of them is very simply the fact that volumes in January tend to be low. It's not a strong month seasonally. And when that's the case, it's dangerous to draw conclusions for the rest of the year from a low volume month. It could just be related to a sales campaign or some other factors, but it's not necessarily predictive of the remainder of the year. Also, for what it's worth, when we look at the end of the year, official inventory data from all players in the market in Mexico is unavailable to us, but we do an estimate based on comparing sales and production trends. When we do that estimate, what we find, this is, by the way, just as an index, this isn't, this doesn't mean there's 100 units of trucks of inventory. It means that compared to January, we saw inventories decline in the spring of 2021 and decline again in the summer, and we saw them increase, we think, at the end of 2021. So we saw, again, during that period of weakness when there was low product availability in the middle of 2021, the market was being supported out of inventory. This ran inventory down, but finally we were able to get that recovery here because production started to come back. December, though, again, it was a good month. But December was partly driven by, according to our figures, a reduction in inventory. And so this is another point to look at, sort of how much can that continue? Maybe for a month or two, but we don't necessarily believe that this can really drive that kind of increase throughout the year. So our outlook is like this. We're basically calling 2022 at this point to be flat, despite that strong selling rate that was observed in December and January. There's a couple things going on. I mentioned already, we don't know how long we can count on this inventory to necessarily push the market. So we think those early figures may be a little bit inflated. Also, obviously the economic outlook remains strong, but those supply constraints and limited chip availability and all the rest are still with us. We believe they'll be with us for the remainder of the year. So we think it's dangerous to assume that the current momentum will continue for that reason. Also, the data don't fully reflect the effects of the Omicron COVID wave in Mexico. We believe we're going to need to see the February and March data to really know what that did or how the industry adjusted. Finally, and I'll show this a little bit later, but in 2021, we saw an increase in used truck imports compared to 2020. So we're still a little bit concerned about that. And actually, if you remember this graph, perhaps if you were in the audience a year ago, you'll recall that the forecasts were higher. One of the reasons why we're being more cautious now is actually that used truck trend, where we're seeing perhaps a little bit more competition for truck buyers. So for all those reasons, we're looking at a solid year, but we think it'll probably end up being flat compared to 2021. 2023 has the potential to be good also. Right now, we're seeing it slightly down compared to 2022, mainly just due to the overall truck cycle that we expect to observe in North America, combined with some of those changing economic dynamics, rising interest rates, inflationary pressure hitting the consumers and goods demand. Some of those factors just kind of creating some headwinds for the market. 2024, on the other hand, hopefully we should see some of those supply issues normalize. Product availability will be good. The economy should still be growing at a normal pace. And we think that with the emission change now planned, expected for 2025 in Mexico, that we should see some pre-buy effect in 2024. The question is how much. These are the numbers. As I mentioned, no surprises. 2022 is relatively flat compared to 2021. Just one caveat, from a timing perspective, it's a little bit, why is it flat? It's a little bit of a question of first half versus second half. This shows the expected monthly trend in 2022, which is in the green dashed line. And you see that we're actually pretty optimistic about 22 in the second half. You see the numbers in many months are above the blue 2021, here and here and here. So and in here finally. So the second half will be stronger than last year. Where we're concerned is in this first half. And as I said, that relates to a couple different factors, including supply chain issues, product availability, and that Omicron wave, just to name a few. So that flat call, this is what's behind it. Finally, perhaps you're wondering, what's the expectation for medium and heavy duty? Heavy duty, we really do expect to be just about flat. We think medium duty will be slightly down in 2022 compared to 2021. Obviously, it's my job to not just give you a number, but to also talk about what things might make it better or worse, so that we can all think about that and plan. Here are some of the factors that we look at in the Mexican forecast. So, in the short term, I think the strongest factor is really that good economy across North America. But we see some other potentials, maybe even for further upside. Obviously, the U.S. supply chain challenges, and we all have seen the problems at U.S. ports, to the extent that maybe Mexico can help relieve some of that pressure on U.S. West Coast ports or even Gulf Coast ports. That could be a boost for Mexico. Obviously, there's also potential for greater public investment. We saw earlier what the public investment did in 2021. There could be more of that. And we also think that with the emission change being pushed out by another year, notwithstanding the pre-buy that we expect to see in 2024, but perhaps just the stable business environment will be a positive. Negatives in the short term. Couple things. Again, the economy is still not back at pre-pandemic levels. The special role of the oil sector actually plays a number of, it sort of is positive and negative. We do see it creating some challenges in the short term. Also, limited availability of trucks and the industry's ability to build trucks we see as a short-term challenge. And then also the Russia-Ukraine crisis, which is now unfolding, and we're still analyzing and we're still considering what the impacts could be. But we think in the very short term, because of impacts on raw material prices and financial market impacts, we think the near-term impact is likely going to involve more inflationary pressure, which is sort of going to add to the challenges that Mexico is already facing. And perhaps net, that's a short-term downside. In the longer term, though, I do want to highlight that oil price rise, if it sticks with us, it could actually become a medium-term positive for the Mexican economy and also for the truck market. So that one sort of cuts both ways. And obviously, we need to continue to watch the situation to see how does it actually develop. Are there going to be other complications? So I have to be careful about that. But all else equal, we think it could be a short-term challenge and maybe a medium-term opportunity for the truck market. Other medium-term opportunities for the truck market, obviously, there's the whole question about used trucks. If they remain at the level they're at now, that could be a bit more of a downside. But if they fall further for different reasons, perhaps that's an upside. Also, I want to mention, the U.S. has passed an infrastructure bill. Obviously, that's a U.S. infrastructure bill, and it's primarily going to benefit the U.S. truck market. However, there could be indirect positive impacts on Mexico's economy just by boosting the overall level of U.S. economic activity, which will naturally sort of demand for goods from Mexico with it indirectly. Those are some of the factors I wanted to point to here. Again, happy to take questions on that later. Just as a final note, I have a few minutes remaining. I wanted to talk in the final section, as I mentioned, about some structural issues. We are I mentioned this, I think, previously. We are very bullish about Mexico's long-term potential as a truck market. Whenever we do cross-country comparisons and look at incomes and economic growth potential and potential for freight growth, um, Mexico always appears as a market that can get to 40,000 units, 50,000 units. It's got really good growth potential, notwithstanding all these short-term questions. And one of the reasons is it's a very transport intense economy. And we see that transport intensity sort of returning over the medium term relative to pre-COVID levels. This chart just kind of shows that. Still, there are obviously challenges for the new truck seller, for the new truck producer. One of those is sort of related to, you can sort of see that a little bit by looking at the market share of, let's call them traditional players, Kenworth, Kenmax, International Freightliner, and the others, and everybody else. And that everybody else might be other imports, perhaps from China. It might also be those used truck imports. And when we look at it this way, we do see that the share of the established players has been falling in recent years. As recently as 2009, that share of the traditional players was 95%. But of course, the market opened up to imports more, and now that share is more like 85%. When we measured it last year, it was 87%. So there has been and continues to be moderate attrition there, which I think we talked about, or we have been talking about. That's one of the trends that we expect to see. One of the reasons why 2021 looks a bit worse, perhaps, for the established players is this increase in the used truck imports, which I mentioned a couple slides ago. These numbers here are based on our customs database, our import-export database that we have here in our company. We call it the Global Trade Atlas, GTA. And this draws on all the official statistics, and we're able to sort it by customs code to identify used trucks going into Mexico, or rather imported by Mexico. And when we look at that number, it was over 4,000 units in 2021, as far as we can tell, which is much higher than it was in 2020, certainly, an unusually weak year perhaps, but also higher than it was in 2019. And so this resumption in the used truck import trend is one of the reasons why we've kind of cut our medium-term new truck outlook slightly compared to a year ago. And when we look at what sort of impacts is this having beyond the overall level of new truck sales, you sort of see it in other areas too. Like one of the things that we look at is the count of vehicles on the road. We call it park, or vehicles in operation. When we look at the park for Mexico, our most recent data point is 2020, and we sort of sort it by age categories. You see here that this increase in used vehicles, the effect that it's having is just making the park on average older, slightly. So when we look at the age brackets here, the bright green is 0 to 5 years. Those are the youngest vehicles. That trend is heavily shaped by the new truck trend. And then you've got the 6 to 10-year-old vehicles, 11 to 13, and then the 14 and more. Really, the takeaway is that compared to 2019, that share of vehicles older than 5 years, let's call it 6 years and above, increased. So that's very much in line with this rise in the used imports, as well as the new truck dynamics that we've seen. And then really just to kind of conclude on a couple points. It's not just used trucks, though. It's also imports from everywhere else that are pressuring the established players in Mexico. When we look at vehicles built in Mexico, sold in Mexico, our analysis shows that that ratio is something like 84%. Let's call it just shy of 85. And then you've got imports from all kinds of other places here. Again, sort of pressuring some of those established players in the market. This ratio has actually not changed very much compared to last time, but it's a trend that we expect to remain and possibly continue. Finally, just very quickly on the Chinese brands, we have become a little more cautious about the volumes coming from China into Mexico. This is based on, from what we can see in the import-export database, again, looking at that global trade atlas that we have in our company. The numbers have not been as strong as we thought they might be through 2021. So these volumes, these bars are lower than we had them a year ago. You see here the units, this is in thousands. So obviously each brand is expected to be under 1,000 units because it's less than one. But together, obviously, it's several thousand units. So we still see potential for these brands to continue to grow their share slightly from estimated 2021 levels. But we now think that share of the overall market is probably going to top out around 5% compared to a slightly higher number previously. Yeah, so I think just to kind of conclude, I think I'm at the end of the scheduled time now. That's our latest published view on the market. As I mentioned, most of those forecasts reflect a position prior to the start of the Russia-Ukraine crisis. I've tried to make a couple comments throughout. I do think that all else equal, probably in 2022, the fallout of the latest international events will probably be negative for the market, both for Mexico and the United States. Looking out ahead to 2023, 2024, it's possible, depending on how things go, that it could be neutral or even slightly positive for Mexico's truck market, just based on the interaction between oil and the broader economy. That remains to be determined, though. That is not our published forecast. That's something that our analysts are continuing to look at across all of our areas, and we'll certainly be communicating more with our clients in the coming days and months. I guess one final comment on that too is but the story isn't just about oil, and these are some of the elements that we're digging into, right? Russia and Ukraine both have a special position in the supply chain in a lot of other areas. One that's particularly interesting for maybe Mexico and South America is Russia's importance as a producer of fertilizers. Just to put this out there, and there's no information that this trade is going to be stopped or anything like that, but just to make the point that Russia's one of the most important sources of fertilizer in the region. If we look here, our data show that about 70% of fertilizer imports in 2020 came from Mexico, came from Russia. I misspoke. So there's other things that we continue to look at as we assess the situation, and really just wanted to share this to make that point as well. So it is very, very dynamic, and we'll continue to understand better as time passes. This slide just summarizes the things I've already mentioned. I think maybe rather than reading it again, might be nice to take any questions if there are any from the audience.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Andrej. Very interesting. And we receive a lot of questions, but to be honest, a lot of them were answered during your presentation. But the last one, it's very interesting, and it's related with the forecast that you made for the 2022 and 2023, if you are considering the slowdown of the OEMs relating with the new vehicles production.
Yes. So we're trying to. What I shared with everybody in the audience, it reflects our best information about the pace of assembly. Having talked to other manufacturers and others in the industry, I believe that our outlook is a little bit on the optimistic side for production, but we think it's achievable. And I should also say that when we talk about production, there's a very important caveat. Our production outlook for 2022 assumes kind of a, let's say about a 10% increase in underlying production rates, sort of frames going down lines at the plants. We believe that is within the realm of possibility, as long as we don't get any major unexpected disruptions, which we did have in 2021. But just to say that, in addition, though, we assume that the so-called incomplete trucks, which were completed, let's say 99%, but are missing one maybe part or system because of chips not being available, we assume that those will be built and completed for the most part, or largely, I should say, in the year 2022. And so we see that as kind of an extra boost to production. So I guess to answer the question, yes, we're trying to track all of the challenges around supply and the pace of assembly. And when we look at 22, we see a slight increase in the underlying pace, but we're also assuming those incomplete trucks can get finished.
Thank you very much for your response, Andrej, and it was a pleasure to have you with us in this event. And thank you very much and have a great day.
Thank you very much. And thank you to everybody in the audience.